The golden light from the crystal chandeliers bounced off every surface in the Grand Metropolitan Hotel ballroom, creating a warm glow that made everything look like a scene from a movie. Rebecca smoothed down her navy blue blazer and checked her reflection in the polished chrome of her wheelchair's armrest. She had learned long ago that first impressions mattered, especially in her line of work. As the vice president of marketing for one of the biggest companies in the city, she knew how to command a room. But tonight felt different somehow. The annual Children's Hospital fundraiser was always a big deal, but this year her company was the main sponsor. That meant all eyes would be on her, watching to see how she handled herself. Rebecca had been to dozens of these fancy events over the years, but they never got easier. Sure, she could give a presentation to a room full of executives without breaking a sweat, but put her in a social setting and suddenly she felt like she was back in high school. Sitting alone at lunch, she rolled through the massive double doors, her wheels silent on the thick carpet. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, mixing with the soft jazz music coming from the corner where a pianist played. Women in elegant dresses glided past her, their heels clicking against the marble floor near the entrance. Men in expensive suits stood in small groups, talking loudly about golf games and stock prices. Rebecca made her way to the registration table, where a young woman with a bright smile handed her a name tag and pointed toward the executive seating area. "You'll be at table number 3, right up front," the volunteer said cheerfully. "There's an elevator just around the corner if you need it for the stage level." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, pinning the name tag to her blazer. She had given up long ago trying to explain that she didn't need special accommodations for everything. Most people meant well, but their constant offers of help sometimes made her feel more different than she already did. The ballroom was filling up quickly. Rebecca recognized several faces from previous events and business meetings. There was the CEO of the tech company that had just gone public, talking animatedly with the mayor. Over by the silent auction tables, she spotted the owner of the biggest law firm in town, bidding on a vacation package to Hawaii. As she approached her assigned table, Rebecca felt her heart sink a little. The round table was set for 8 people, with crisp white linens and sparkling silverware at each place setting. Fresh flowers in tall vases created a beautiful centerpiece, and elegant programs were placed at each seat. But right now, every chair was empty. She positioned herself at her designated spot and pulled out her phone, pretending to check important emails. In reality, she was scrolling through social media, looking at pictures of her college friends at various weekend events. It was easier than sitting there looking around the room, waiting for someone to join her. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Rebecca watched as other tables filled up with laughing groups of colleagues and friends. The pharmaceutical executives at Table 5 were already deep into animated conversation about their recent merger. Table 7 was full of hospital board members sharing stories about their latest charity golf tournament. A server approached her table, carrying a tray of champagne glasses. "Would you like some champagne while you wait for your party?" he asked politely. "Just water for now, thanks," Rebecca replied, forcing a smile. The word party stung a little. She was her own party, apparently. She had been in situations like this before, but it never stopped bothering her. In the business world, she was respected and valued. Her marketing campaigns had won awards, and her team looked up to her. She had worked twice as hard as everyone else to get where she was, especially after her accident in college. A drunk driver had changed her life in an instant, but she had refused to let it define her completely. The accident had happened during her final semester of business school. One minute she was walking back to her apartment after studying late at the library, and the next minute she was waking up in a hospital bed, unable to feel her legs. Her fiancé had stuck around for about 6 months, making all the right supportive noises. But eventually, the reality of dating someone in a wheelchair had been too much for him. She had finished her MBA from that same hospital bed, determined not to let anything stop her from achieving her goals. Now, 10 years later, she was successful by any measure. She had a corner office, a team of 15 people, and a salary that let her live comfortably. But success in business didn't automatically translate to success in social situations. People still didn't know how to act around her sometimes. They either treated her like she was made of glass, or they acted like her wheelchair made her invisible. Rebecca glanced at her watch. The cocktail hour was supposed to last another 15 minutes, but it felt like it had been going on forever. She could see her colleagues from the company scattered around the room, networking and making small talk with potential clients. They had all said hello when she first arrived, making the usual polite conversation about how nice the venue looked and how important the cause was. But then they had drifted away to mingle, leaving her alone at the table. It wasn't that they were being mean or deliberately excluding her. They probably didn't even realize they were doing it. But when people were standing around in groups, chatting and moving from conversation to conversation, it was easy to forget about the person sitting down. Rebecca had learned to navigate boardrooms and conference rooms with confidence, but cocktail parties were a different challenge altogether. She watched a group of women near the silent auction tables, laughing at something one of them had said. They looked so relaxed and natural, like this kind of event was as easy as breathing for them. Rebecca envied that ease, that ability to float through social situations without thinking about logistics or accessibility or whether there would be a place for her to fit in. A waiter appeared at her elbow with a tray of appetizers. "Bacon-wrapped scallops?" he offered. "Sure, thank you," she said, taking one with a cocktail napkin. At least the food was good. She had skipped lunch, knowing there would be plenty to eat at the event. The pianist started playing a familiar song, something soft and jazzy that she recognized but couldn't quite name. The sound mixed with the chatter and laughter around her, creating a soundtrack that felt both festive and lonely at the same time. Rebecca took a sip of her water and looked around the room again, trying to project confidence even though she felt anything but confident at the moment. She pulled up the event program on her phone, reading through the schedule for the evening. Cocktail hour until 7, then dinner, and the silent auction results. After that, there would be speeches from the hospital administrators and a few of the major donors. Finally, dancing until midnight for those who wanted to stay. Rebecca usually left before the dancing started. It was easier that way. As she scrolled through the program, she noticed that one of the speakers was someone from the hospital's physical therapy department. She made a mental note to pay attention during that part of the presentation. Rebecca had spent months in physical therapy after her accident, and she always felt a connection to the people who worked in that field. They had helped her learn how to navigate the world from a wheelchair, how to transfer in and out of cars, how to live independently again. The cocktail hour was winding down now, and people were starting to move toward their assigned tables. Rebecca watched hopefully as a few people approached her table, but they walked past to the one behind her. Her heart sank a little more with each passing minute. Maybe her colleagues would join her once the dinner portion started. Maybe they were just caught up in work conversations and would remember where they were supposed to sit. But as the lights dimmed slightly and the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone to welcome everyone, Rebecca realized she might be spending the evening alone at her table for 8. She straightened her shoulders and put on her professional smile, ready to make the best of whatever the night would bring. David adjusted his tie for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, wondering why he had agreed to come to this event. The burgundy silk felt foreign against his neck, a reminder that formal occasions were not his natural habitat. As the head of pediatric physical therapy at Children's Hospital, he was more comfortable in scrubs and sneakers than in this stiff dress shirt and polished shoes that pinched his feet. He stood near the entrance of the ballroom, watching the crowd of well-dressed people flow around him like water around a rock. Everyone else seemed to know exactly what they were doing, who they should talk to, and what witty comments to make about the weather or the hospital's latest fundraising goals. David felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. The truth was, he hadn't wanted to come at all. His daughter Lily was spending the weekend with his ex-wife, which meant he had planned to spend Saturday night on his couch, probably watching old movies and eating takeout Chinese food. But his supervisor had made it clear that attendance wasn't really optional for department heads. "It's important for the physical therapy team to have representation," she had said. "You don't have to stay all night, just make an appearance." So here he was, making an appearance and counting the minutes until he could politely escape. David grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and took a small sip, letting his eyes wander around the room. The decorations were impressive, he had to admit. Thousands of tiny white lights were strung along the walls, creating a magical atmosphere. Round tables covered in crisp white linens filled the space, each one decorated with tall centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. It was the kind of elegant setup that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He recognized some faces in the crowd. There was Dr. Patterson from cardiology, holding court near the silent auction tables with his usual group of admirers. The hospital's chief administrator was working the room like a politician, shaking hands and making small talk with potential donors. David spotted a few nurses from the pediatric ward, looking much more glamorous than they did in their hospital uniforms, but it was the pharmaceutical executives and corporate sponsors who really commanded attention. They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, their expensive suits and designer dresses marking them as the people with the real money and power. David watched them network, making mental notes about who was talking to whom, filing away information for future business dealings. As he observed the social dance happening around him, David's attention was drawn to something that made him pause. Across the room, near the front of the ballroom, a woman sat alone at what was clearly one of the premium tables. She was checking her phone, but something about her posture suggested she wasn't really reading whatever was on the screen. She was just trying to look busy. David found himself studying her more closely. She was probably in her early 30s with shoulder-length dark hair that caught the light from the chandeliers. Her navy blue blazer looked expensive and professional, the kind of outfit that said she was someone important in the business world. But what struck him most was the way she held herself, confident and poised, even sitting alone. It took him a moment to notice the wheelchair. Once he did, other details fell into place. The way the table had been set up with slightly more space on one side. The fact that she was positioned where she could easily see the stage without anyone blocking her view. The wheelchair itself was sleek and modern, clearly high-end equipment that probably cost more than David's car. But what really caught his attention was the empty chairs around her table. 7 empty chairs at what was obviously supposed to be a table for 8. David glanced at his watch. The cocktail hour had been going on for almost 45 minutes, and dinner service would start soon. Where was everyone else who was supposed to be sitting with her? He watched as a server approached her table with a tray of appetizers. She took one politely and thanked him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. David recognized that smile. He'd worn it himself many times since his divorce. It was the smile you put on when you were trying to convince everyone, including yourself, that you were perfectly fine being alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, standing by himself near the entrance, feeling awkward and out of place, while across the room she sat by herself at her table, probably feeling just as isolated. 2 people in a room full of hundreds, both struggling with the same basic human need to connect with others. David thought about his own situation. Since the divorce 2 years ago, social events had become minefields of awkwardness. People didn't know whether to ask about his ex-wife or pretend the marriage had never happened. Coupled friends sometimes acted like divorce might be contagious, while single friends assumed he was ready to jump back into dating when he was still figuring out how to be a single father to an 8-year-old girl. Work was easier. At the hospital, he knew his role and his value. The kids he worked with didn't care about his personal life. They just wanted someone who could help them get stronger, who could make physical therapy feel less scary and more like play. He was good at his job, maybe even great at it. But put him in a room full of adults in formal wear, and suddenly he felt like he was back in middle school, standing at the edge of the cafeteria with his lunch tray, looking for a place to sit. As he continued watching the woman at the table, David noticed other things that bothered him. The way people walked past her table without really seeing her. The slightly awkward way the servers approached her, as if they weren't sure of the proper protocol. The fact that several people had glanced in her direction but then looked away quickly, as if making eye contact might somehow be inappropriate. David knew that feeling too, though for different reasons. As one of only 3 male physical therapists in the pediatric department, he was used to being the odd one out. Parent conferences, department meetings, hospital social events. He was almost always surrounded by women who had their own established friendships and communication styles. It wasn't that anyone was deliberately excluding him, but he often felt like he was speaking a slightly different language than everyone else. He watched as the woman checked her phone again, and this time he was close enough to see that she wasn't actually reading anything. The screen was just lit up on her home page. She was doing what David himself had been doing for the past hour, trying to look occupied so that other people wouldn't feel sorry for her. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone on the small stage, preparing to announce that dinner service would begin soon. Around the room, people started moving toward their assigned tables. David looked down at his ticket to remind himself where he was supposed to sit. Table 12, toward the back of the room. He'd be sitting with other department heads and mid-level hospital administrators, perfectly pleasant people who would make perfectly pleasant conversation about perfectly safe topics. But as he started walking toward his assigned seat, David found himself slowing down. His eyes kept drifting back to the woman at table 3, still sitting alone as people filled the tables around her. The empty chairs at her table seemed to mock the whole idea of community and connection that events like this were supposed to represent. David had spent his entire career helping people overcome physical challenges, teaching them how to adapt and thrive despite limitations that others might see as insurmountable. He worked with kids who had been born with disabilities, others who had been injured in accidents, and some who were dealing with chronic conditions that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Every day, he watched these young people display courage and determination that put most adults to shame. So why was he, a grown man who helped others face their fears every day, so afraid to walk across a room and introduce himself to someone who was sitting alone? The question hit him harder than he expected. Here he was, thinking about how isolated and awkward he felt, while across the room someone else was dealing with the same feelings. Maybe worse feelings, considering the empty chairs around her table and the way people seemed to be unconsciously avoiding her. David made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of heading to table 12, he found himself walking toward the front of the room, toward table 3, toward the woman who was still pretending to read her phone while everyone else settled into their seats for dinner. His heart was beating faster than it should have been for such a simple action, but he kept walking anyway. Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that scare us most. David's hands were sweating as he walked across the ballroom floor, weaving between tables where other guests were settling into their seats for dinner. Each step felt heavier than the last, and he found himself second-guessing the decision with every foot closer to table 3. What was he doing? What would he even say? "Hi, I noticed you're sitting alone and thought I'd rescue you?" That sounded terrible even in his own head. He paused about 10 feet away from her table, pretending to check his phone while he tried to calm his racing heart. This was ridiculous. He talked to people every day at work. He gave presentations to groups of doctors and administrators. He counseled worried parents about their children's recovery plans. So why did walking up to one woman at a charity dinner feel like climbing Mount Everest? Rebecca looked up from her phone at that moment, and their eyes met briefly across the short distance. David felt his stomach flip, but he managed what he hoped was a friendly smile before quickly looking back down at his phone screen. Great. Now she probably thought he was some creepy guy staring at her from across the room. The servers were starting to bring out the salad course to tables that were fully occupied. David watched as a young man in a crisp white shirt approached Rebecca's table with obvious uncertainty. The server clearly wasn't sure how to navigate around her wheelchair, and David could see the awkward dance that followed. The server tried to place the salad plate in front of her while standing at an odd angle, nearly knocking over her water glass in the process. "I'm so sorry," the server said, his face turning red. "I didn't want to. I wasn't sure how to—" "It's fine," Rebecca said with practiced patience. "You can just reach across like you would for anyone else. The wheelchair doesn't bite." The server laughed nervously and managed to get the salad placed properly, but David could see how the interaction had affected both of them. The server hurried away looking flustered, while Rebecca sat back in her chair with a slight sigh that spoke of countless similar encounters. That small moment crystallized something for David. He realized that his nervousness about approaching her wasn't really about her at all. It was about his own insecurities and fears of saying the wrong thing. But she was dealing with much more significant challenges than his social anxiety, and she was handling them with grace and humor. Before he could lose his nerve again, David straightened his shoulders and walked the remaining distance to her table. His heart was still pounding, but he forced himself to speak before his courage could desert him completely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice coming out slightly higher than normal. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Hi, I'm David Williams. I work at the hospital." Rebecca looked up at him with raised eyebrows, and David suddenly realized how his introduction might sound. Like he was there in some kind of professional capacity, maybe checking on her welfare or something equally patronizing. He continued quickly, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm here as a guest, just like you. I'm head of pediatric physical therapy, but I'm not here in any official capacity or anything." She studied his face for a moment, and David found himself holding his breath. Her expression was guarded but not unfriendly, like she was trying to figure out what he wanted and whether she should be annoyed or amused by his obvious nervousness. "I know this is going to sound strange," David continued, deciding that honesty was his only option at this point. "But I've been standing over there for the past hour feeling completely out of place at this whole thing. I'm terrible at networking events and cocktail party small talk, and I noticed you sitting here, and you look like someone who might understand what it feels like to be surrounded by people but still feel like you don't quite fit in." The words tumbled out faster than he intended, and as soon as he finished speaking, David was sure he had made a complete mess of things. He was about to apologize and retreat to his assigned table when Rebecca did something unexpected. She laughed. It wasn't a polite social laugh or a mocking laugh. It was genuine and warm, and it completely transformed her face. The guarded expression melted away, replaced by something that looked like relief mixed with amusement. "That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me all evening," she said, gesturing to one of the empty chairs at her table. "Please sit down. I'm Rebecca Chen, and you're absolutely right about not fitting in. I've been pretending to read important emails for the past 45 minutes because it seemed better than staring at these empty chairs and wondering where my colleagues disappeared." "Two!" David felt a rush of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down, immediately feeling better than he had all evening. "So I'm not the only one who feels like I need a manual for these things?" "Oh, you definitely need a manual," Rebecca said with a grin. Chapter 1. How to make small talk about golf when you've never held a golf club. Chapter 2. Pretending to understand wine when you usually drink beer from a bottle. Chapter 3. Looking interested when someone tells you about their recent vacation to their summer house in the Hamptons. David laughed, feeling the tension in his shoulders start to ease. You forgot Chapter 4. How to eat tiny appetizers without dropping them on your fancy clothes that you only wear twice a year. And Chapter 5, Rebecca added, how to dance at these things when you have no rhythm and 2 left feet. She paused, then added with a self-deprecating smile, well, in my case, no feet at all. David wasn't sure how to respond to that. He didn't want to ignore what she'd said, but he also didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Rebecca seemed to sense his uncertainty. It's okay, she said. You can acknowledge that I'm in a wheelchair. I promise it won't hurt my feelings. In fact, it's refreshing when people don't pretend not to notice. I noticed, David said carefully. But honestly, what I noticed first was that you were sitting alone at a table that was clearly meant for 8 people, and that seemed wrong regardless of whether you were in a wheelchair or not. Rebecca's expression softened. That's actually really nice. Most people either stare at the chair and forget there's a person in it, or they work so hard to ignore the chair that they end up ignoring me too. A server appeared at their table with David's salad, looking confused about why there was now someone sitting at table 3 who wasn't on his seating chart. Is everything all right here? He asked. Everything's perfect, David said with more confidence than he'd felt all evening. I was at the wrong table before. This is where I'm supposed to be. The server shrugged and continued with his rounds. Rebecca raised her water glass in a mock toast. To being at the right table, she said. David clinked his glass against hers. to honest introductions and empty chairs that finally have someone in them. I have to ask, Rebecca said as they started eating their salads, what made you decide to come over here? I mean, really? It's not like you knew me or had any reason to think I'd want company. David thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I've been divorced for 2 years, and I have an 8-year-old daughter who I only see half the time now. I spend a lot of evenings sitting alone at my kitchen table, eating dinner and pretending I'm fine with the quiet. When I saw you sitting here by yourself, I recognized something familiar. Not the specific situation, but the feeling behind it. Rebecca nodded slowly. The feeling of being surrounded by people but still feeling invisible. Exactly, David said. And I guess I thought that maybe if I was brave enough to walk over here and introduce myself, maybe we could both feel a little less invisible for one evening. Well, Rebecca said, taking another bite of her salad. Mission accomplished. This is the first real conversation I've had all night. Probably the first real conversation I've had at one of these events ever. David felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the wine. They hadn't even been served yet. Sometimes the best decisions were the ones that scared you most. What had started as David's nervous attempt to rescue someone from sitting alone quickly turned into something neither of them had expected. As the servers brought out the main course, David and Rebecca found themselves deep in conversation, completely forgetting about the formal dinner happening around them. So you're telling me, Rebecca said, cutting into her chicken with a look of mock disbelief, that you're the only guy in a department full of women and you still feel like the outsider? David laughed, nearly choking on his water. You have no idea. Last month we had a department meeting where they spent 20 minutes discussing the best places to get manicures. I just sat there nodding like I had strong opinions about nail art. That's hilarious, Rebecca said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. But I bet you're great at your job. Kids probably love having a male physical therapist. It's different for them. They do seem to respond well, David admitted, especially the boys who are dealing with sports injuries. They feel like I understand what it's like to want to get back on the field or the court. But the parents, sometimes the moms look at me like they're not sure if they should trust their kid with a man. Rebecca nodded knowingly. I get something similar in the business world. When I roll into a boardroom full of executives, there's always this moment where everyone tries to figure out what I'm doing there. Are you the assistant? Are you someone's wife? Surely you can't be the person who's about to present the marketing strategy that could make or break the quarter. That must be incredibly frustrating, David said, and Rebecca could hear the genuine understanding in his voice. It was, at first, she said. But you know what I learned? The surprise factor actually works in my favor sometimes. People underestimate me, so when I deliver something brilliant, it hits even harder. David smiled at her confidence. I like that attitude. Turn the challenge into an advantage. Exactly. Although I have to admit, it gets exhausting always having to prove yourself. Sometimes I just want to walk into a room and have people assume I belong there. I think I understand that more than you might expect, David said quietly. Being a single dad in a world of mom groups and parent committees, there's always this feeling like you have to work twice as hard to prove you're not just the weekend babysitter. Rebecca studied his face, seeing something there that made her want to know more. How long have you been divorced? 2 years. My daughter Lily was 6 when it happened. The hardest part isn't the loneliness, although that's real. It's the constant worry that I'm not enough for her, that she needs things I can't give her because I'm just one person trying to do the job of 2. What's she like? Rebecca asked softly. David's whole demeanor changed when he talked about his daughter. His face lit up in a way that made Rebecca's heart skip a little. She's incredible. Smart, funny, completely fearless. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, but she also wants to play professional soccer and be a chef. She hasn't figured out yet that you have to choose just one dream. Who says you have to choose just one? Rebecca said. Maybe she'll be a veterinarian who cooks for soccer players on the weekends. David laughed. I'll suggest that to her. She'd probably love the idea of combining all her interests into one impossible career. The conversation flowed so naturally that neither of them noticed when the servers cleared their dinner plates. Around them, other tables were listening to speeches from hospital administrators and major donors, but David and Rebecca were in their own little bubble of connection. Can I ask you something? David said, his tone becoming more serious. You mentioned earlier that people either stare at your wheelchair or pretend not to see it. How did that happen? I mean, if you're comfortable talking about it. Rebecca appreciated that he asked permission before diving into personal territory. Car accident during my last semester of business school. Drunk driver ran a red light while I was walking back from the library one night. One minute I'm worried about my final exams, the next minute I'm learning words like spinal cord injury and permanent paralysis. That must have been terrifying, David said quietly. It was. But you know what was almost worse? Watching people I thought cared about me slowly disappear from my life. My fiancé stuck around for about 6 months, making all the right supportive sounds, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. David felt a flash of anger towards someone he'd never met. He sounds like an idiot. Rebecca smiled at his immediate loyalty. Maybe. Or maybe he was just honest about what he could handle. Not everyone is cut out for the challenges that come with dating someone with a disability. The logistics alone can be overwhelming. What kind of logistics? David asked, genuinely curious. Well, for starters, not every restaurant or venue is accessible. You have to think about things like bathroom accessibility, whether there are stairs, if there's adequate parking. Then there's the social stuff. People stare, sometimes they make comments. Some guys want to date me because they think it makes them look like good people, like they're doing charity work. Others are scared off by the thought of dealing with medical appointments and equipment and all the practical stuff. David listened carefully, trying to imagine navigating the world with those additional considerations. That sounds exhausting. It can be. But it's also taught me to appreciate the people who see past all of that. Who see me first, wheelchair second? She looked at him meaningfully. Like someone who notices I'm sitting alone and decides to do something about it, instead of assuming I want to be left alone because I'm different. They were interrupted by the sound of music starting up. The hospital's fundraising coordinator had taken the microphone to announce that the dancing portion of the evening would begin shortly. Oh no, David said, looking genuinely panicked. I forgot about the dancing part. Rebecca laughed at his expression. Not a dancer? I have 2 left feet and the rhythm of a broken washing machine, David said. Lily tried to teach me some moves she learned in her dance class, but it was hopeless. I looked like I was having some kind of medical emergency. Well, Rebecca said with a mischievous smile, lucky for you, I happen to be an excellent dancer. David looked confused. But
how do you
dance in a wheelchair? Rebecca finished for him. Same way you dance with feet, just with different body parts. Want me to show you? David felt that familiar flutter of nervousness, but this time it was mixed with excitement. I should probably warn you that I might embarrass both of us. Impossible, Rebecca said, already moving her wheelchair back from the table. The secret to dancing is not caring what anyone else thinks. And besides, I have a feeling you're going to surprise yourself. As they moved toward the dance floor, David realized that this evening had already surprised him in ways he never could have imagined. He'd come to this event dreading every minute, planning to leave as early as possible. Instead, he'd found someone who made him laugh, who challenged his assumptions, and who made him feel more comfortable in his own skin than he had in months. The band started playing something slow and jazzy, and Rebecca positioned her wheelchair in front of him. Okay, she said, reaching up to take his hands. Lesson number 1. Forget everything you think you know about dancing. David looked down at her. This amazing woman who had turned his awkward evening into something magical, and realized he was ready to learn a completely new way to move through the world. The hotel's garden was a complete contrast to the bustling ballroom they had just left behind. String lights twinkled in the trees above them, casting a warm glow over the stone pathways and flower beds. The sound of the jazz band was muffled by the glass doors, creating a peaceful backdrop for conversation. David pushed open the heavy door and held it while Rebecca wheeled herself onto the terrace, both of them grateful for the cool night air after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. Much better, Rebecca said, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. I love these events, but sometimes I need a break from all the noise and small talk. David settled onto a stone bench positioned near a fountain, close enough to Rebecca that they could talk easily, but far enough to give her space to maneuver her wheelchair comfortably. That was amazing, by the way. The dancing. I can't believe you got me to actually move to the music without falling over. Rebecca laughed, her face still glowing from the excitement of their time on the dance floor. You were better than you thought you'd be. Once you stopped overthinking every step, you actually found the rhythm. I think that was all you, David said honestly. You made it feel natural somehow. Like we'd been dancing together for years instead of figuring it out as we went along. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the water trickling in the fountain and the distant sounds of the city beyond the hotel walls. David found himself stealing glances at Rebecca, still amazed by how the evening had transformed from dreaded obligation to something he didn't want to end. "Can I tell you something?" Rebecca said suddenly, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "I almost didn't come tonight." "Really? But your company is the main sponsor. Wouldn't that have been noticed?" "Oh, it definitely would have been noticed," Rebecca said with a rueful smile. "But I've gotten really good at coming up with excuses. Sudden illness, family emergency, conflicting client meeting. I have a whole repertoire of believable reasons to avoid social events." David turned to face her more fully. "What changed your mind?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with the hem of her blazer. "Do you know what it's like to be successful in your career but feel like a complete failure at everything else?" The question hit closer to home than David expected. "Actually, yes, I do. I have everything I thought I wanted when I was in business school," Rebecca continued. "Corner office, great salary, team of people who respect my work. I won a marketing award last year that I'd been chasing for my entire career. But when I got home that night, there was no one to celebrate with. I ordered Chinese takeout and ate it alone while watching Netflix. And I remember thinking that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture." David nodded, understanding completely. "After my divorce was finalized, I threw myself into work. Stayed late every night, took on extra projects, volunteered for weekend shifts. My colleagues started calling me the most dedicated employee they'd ever seen. But really, I was just avoiding going home to an empty apartment." "Exactly," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a note of relief at being understood. "Work became my safe place because it was the only place where I felt valuable. But tonight, sitting at that table alone while my colleagues networked around me, I realized that I'd built this successful career but somehow forgotten how to build relationships." "I don't think you've forgotten," David said gently. "I think maybe you just got tired of trying with people who didn't appreciate what you had to offer." Rebecca looked at him with surprise. "That's actually really insightful." "I have my moments," David said with a self-deprecating smile. "Usually they happen around 2 in the morning when I'm lying awake wondering where I went wrong." "You have those nights too?" Rebecca asked, more than I'd like to admit, especially on the weekends when Lily's at her mom's house. The apartment gets so quiet that I can hear my upstairs neighbor's television through the ceiling. I lie there thinking about all the ways I've messed up as a husband, as a father, as a person in general. Rebecca wheeled her chair closer to the bench. "What do you think about specifically?" David was quiet for a moment, considering whether to share something he'd never said out loud to anyone. "I think about whether Lily would be better off if her mom and I had stayed together, even though we were miserable. I wonder if I'm selfish for wanting joint custody when it means she has to pack a bag and switch houses every few days. I worry that when she grows up, she'll remember me as the dad who tried too hard to make everything fun because he only had her half the time." "David," Rebecca said softly, "from everything you've told me about her tonight, it's clear that Lily adores you. Kids know when they're loved, and they know when their parents are genuine. She's better off having 2 parents who are happy apart than 2 parents who are miserable together." "Logically, I know that," David said. "But at 3 in the morning, logic doesn't always win." "I know exactly what you mean," Rebecca said. "I have my own 3 in the morning thoughts. I wonder if I'll ever find someone who wants to build a life with me, not despite my wheelchair, but including it. I think about whether I'm fooling myself by staying in a job that demands so much. Travel and networking when both of those things are exponentially harder for me than for my colleagues." David studied her face in the soft light from the string lights above them. "Do you want to travel less?" "No, that's the thing. I love my job. I love the challenge, the strategy, the creative problem solving. But sometimes I wonder if I'm pushing myself so hard professionally because I've given up on the personal stuff. What if you didn't have to choose? David asked. What if you could have both? Rebecca smiled sadly. That's a nice thought, but realistically, dating is complicated when you're in a wheelchair. The logistics alone can be overwhelming. And most guys either see me as an inspiration story or a charity case, neither of which makes for great relationship material. What about guys who see you as a brilliant, funny, beautiful woman who happens to use a wheelchair to get around? David asked quietly. Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat at the way he was looking at her. Are there guys like that? I think there might be, David said, moving from the bench to kneel beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level. In fact, I'm pretty sure I met one tonight. Rebecca felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were good tears. David, I came to this event tonight dreading every minute of it, he continued. I was planning to eat dinner as quickly as possible and leave before the dancing started. Instead, I found someone who makes me laugh, who understands what it feels like to be successful, but lonely, and who taught me that dancing is less about perfect steps and more about finding someone whose rhythm matches yours. I can't believe this is real, Rebecca whispered. What part? Any of it. Meeting someone who actually sees me, having a conversation that doesn't feel forced or awkward, dancing with someone who didn't act like it was a charitable act. She paused, then added quietly, feeling hopeful about something other than work for the first time in years. David reached up to touch her hand gently. It's real, and if you're willing, I'd like to see where this goes beyond tonight. Rebecca looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt full of possibilities instead of just obstacles to overcome. 3 months later, Rebecca rolled through the same elegant double doors of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, but everything about this moment felt completely different from that night in September. The ballroom looked identical with its crystal chandeliers and white linens, but Rebecca no longer felt like she was entering enemy territory. This time she wasn't alone. David walked beside her, carrying a manila folder that contained the quarterly reports for the hospital board meeting. But also tucked inside was a drawing that his daughter Lily had made the night before. It showed 3 stick figures standing next to what was clearly meant to be a zoo elephant, with My Family's Fun Day written in purple crayon across the top. Rebecca had been touched when Lily asked if she could include her in the family drawing, and even more touched when David insisted on bringing it to show her during their lunch break. Table 3 again? David asked, checking the seating chart near the entrance. Actually, table 1 this time, Rebecca said with a smile. Apparently, when you're dating someone on the hospital board and you actually show up to events, they upgrade your seating. David laughed. I'm pretty sure it has more to do with your company increasing their sponsorship donation after our marketing presentation last month. Maybe a little bit of both, Rebecca admitted. She had been surprised by how much her perspective on these events had changed once she started attending them with David. What had once felt like social torture now felt manageable, even enjoyable sometimes. Having someone who genuinely wanted to spend time with her made all the difference. As they made their way to their table, Rebecca noticed how differently people reacted to her now. It wasn't that the wheelchair had become invisible, but somehow being part of a couple seemed to make others more comfortable. They said hello to both of them instead of just David. They included her naturally in conversations instead of directing all their comments through him. It was a subtle shift, but Rebecca felt it keenly. Dr. Williams, called out Janet Morrison, the hospital's chief administrator, as she approached their table. And Rebecca, so good to see you both. How's that new pediatric wing fundraising campaign coming along? Ahead of schedule and over budget target, Rebecca replied with professional satisfaction. The community response has been incredible. We should have enough to break ground by spring. That's wonderful news. David, you must be excited about the new therapy facilities. Beyond excited, David said, his enthusiasm genuine. The current space is so cramped that we sometimes have 3 kids doing exercises in the same room. The new wing will triple our capacity and give us space for some equipment we've been dreaming about for years. Janet smiled at both of them. It's been wonderful watching this partnership develop. Professional and personal. she added with a knowing wink before moving on to greet other attendees. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm slightly. She was still getting used to being half of a couple in these professional settings. For so long, she had been just Rebecca, the marketing executive who worked harder than anyone else and went home alone. Now she was Rebecca who had plans for Sunday brunch and someone to call when she had a frustrating day at work. "Remember when you told me you were terrible at these networking things?" Rebecca asked David as they settled into their seats. "I still am," David said with a grin. "I just have excellent backup now." The truth was, they had both changed over the past 3 months, but in ways that felt natural rather than forced. David had gained confidence in social situations, partly because Rebecca had taught him that most networking was just having genuine conversations with people about things they cared about. Rebecca had rediscovered her ability to let people get close to her, something she had protected herself against for years after her accident. Their relationship had developed gradually, carefully, with both of them conscious of not rushing into something that could complicate their lives. Their first official date had been coffee on a Sunday afternoon, chosen specifically because it was low pressure and easy to end gracefully if things felt awkward. Instead, coffee had turned into a long walk through the park, which had turned into dinner at a small restaurant David knew that had excellent accessibility and even better pasta. The second date had been David's suggestion, a trip to the zoo with Lily. Rebecca had been nervous about meeting his daughter, worried about how an 8-year-old would react to her wheelchair. But Lily had been curious rather than uncomfortable, asking direct questions that adults usually danced around. "Does it hurt to not walk?" she had asked. "Can you feel your legs at all?" Rebecca had answered honestly, and Lily had accepted the information and moved on to asking if they could see the penguins next. That day at the zoo had been a turning point for all three of them. Rebecca discovered that she actually enjoyed spending time with children outside of a professional context. Lily decided that Rebecca was pretty cool and started asking when she would come over for dinner again. And David realized that his two favorite people in the world got along naturally, without any of the forced interaction he had worried about. Now, 3 months later, Sunday dinners at David's apartment had become a regular tradition. Rebecca would arrive around 4 o'clock, usually with ingredients for whatever recipe she and Lily had decided to try that week. David had quickly learned that Rebecca was an adventurous cook who enjoyed teaching, while Lily was an enthusiastic student who wasn't afraid to experiment with flavors. These dinners had become the highlight of Rebecca's week. After years of eating takeout alone while catching up on work emails, she found herself looking forward to the chaos of cooking with an 8-year-old, the stories about Lily's school week, and the comfortable conversation with David while they cleaned up dishes together. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Rebecca said to David as they waited for the meeting to begin. "What's that?" "I haven't made an excuse to skip a social event since we started dating." "Not once." David considered this. "That's interesting. I haven't had a single one of those 3 in the morning worry sessions since we started spending Sunday evenings together." "Really? Really? It's hard to lie awake wondering if you're a terrible person when you've spent the day with people who obviously enjoy your company." Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand. "Same here. It's amazing how much easier everything becomes when you have someone in your corner." The meeting was called to order, and Rebecca found herself paying attention in a way she never had before. It wasn't just about her company's involvement anymore. She was genuinely invested in the hospital's success because it mattered to David, and David mattered to her. When they announced the groundbreaking date for the new pediatric wing, she felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her professional accomplishments. After the meeting ended, David walked with Rebecca toward the parking garage where her car was waiting. They had driven separately because Rebecca had a client dinner afterward, but David would be at her apartment later that evening to help her practice a presentation she was giving the next day. "Same question as 3 months ago," David said as they reached her car, echoing the words that had started everything between them. "Will you be my date to next week's fundraising gala?" Rebecca looked up at him, this man who had seen her sitting alone and decided to do something about it, who had changed her life simply by being brave enough to introduce himself. "Always," she said, reaching up to kiss him softly. "But this time neither of us will be sitting alone." As she drove away, Rebecca thought about how dramatically her life had changed since that September evening when she had dreaded attending the charity dinner. She still worked just as hard, still traveled for business, still dealt with the daily challenges that came with navigating the world in a wheelchair. But now she also had Sunday dinners to look forward to, text messages that made her smile during boring meetings, and someone who understood that love wasn't about fixing each other's problems but about facing them together. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations began with one person brave enough to cross a room and ask someone else not to sit alone.